Great. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the first in a series of brief podcasts that the Virginia Housing Alliance is sponsoring. And we'll be talking to a variety of people who have unique perspectives on the state of affordable housing here in Virginia and around the nation. And I'm really pleased that we're kicking this off with Ethan Handelman, an old acquaintance of mine who I met many years ago in Washington. And most recently, Ethan served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs at HUD, appointed by President Biden. Prior to that, Ethan held policy posts at FHFA, National Housing Conference, and was a principal at Recap Advisors. And Ethan, I understand you're moving on to the CEO position at CEDAC, Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation in Boston, which is really one of the oldest and storied CDCs and nonprofits involved in housing, affordable housing development and preservation in the country. So congratulations on that and the move to Boston. So suffice it to say, these are unprecedented times for affordable housing programs and policy, with a vast range of threats and changes that have the potential to undermine and fundamentally shift 50 years of federal housing precedent. So Ethan, I know very recently as a Biden appointee at HUD, you departed just as the DOGE crew was entering the building. And I think you have stayed in touch a little bit with some of your former colleagues at HUD headquarters. And I wonder if you might start by telling us what the mood is at HUD right now, in terms of the people who remain, and we'll dig a little bit more into the staffing and such. But what's your top line view of kind of the mood at HUD?
Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks for having me, and thanks to the Virginia Housing Alliance for having me. As you say, we are old friends, old acquaintances, and I know the work of the Virginia Housing Alliance from long back, and I'm really glad to be here because that voice of folks doing the work of affordable housing is incredibly important. So really glad to be here. In terms of the mood, it's as you would expect. It ain't good. Remember that, the Weaver Building here in DC, the HUD headquarters, and the field offices all across the country, where the majority of HUD staff work, they're filled with public servants who want to do affordable housing work, regardless of party or political affiliation. They want to make sure people have a safe place to live. What we have seen thus far, and I say this as an observer, right, from outside the department, and from talking to folks inside, has been a real assault on the work of housing. It's distressing. There have been so many things, and we can get into the specifics if you want, that have made it hard for people to do their jobs, made it hard for them to know what to expect. There has been a widely circulated plan that the administration aims to cut the HUD workforce in half. And there were, roughly 9,000 HUD staff when I left. We had grown the staff to meet the very major needs. Specifically in multifamily, we grew from 1,080 when I started to 1,250 when I left. And that was in the face of significant amount of retirement, of departure. Folks who had been doing good work for a very long time and were ready to move on to either their retirement or their next gig. And we were backfilling and expanding even as that was happening. So when I started, more than 50% of the multifamily workforce was full retirement eligible that day. By the time I left, that percentage had totally flipped. So we had a lot of very dedicated, new to HUD, but quite skilled and experienced staff. Today, my sense is about 2,300 staff have already selected, through that fork in the road email or other options, departure from HUD. and they're not backfilling. Those are positions that will not be filled by this administration thus far. So that alone contributes to a very, very tough mood.
That's almost a quarter of the HUD staff at this point. Yeah. So I know that I think many or maybe all federal agencies were required to submit these detailed budget or staff reduction plans a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And some of that had leaked out earlier, and it did have these draconian cuts, as you said, half of the HUD staff, and in some offices, CPD, FHEO, was 80-90% of the staff. Have you heard anything about that final plan that was developed at HUD? It seems like it was submitted, but no, there hasn't been any word come out yet about what's contained in that.
And I think that's an accurate summary. So I haven't seen the plan, right? I'm thankfully no longer in a position to see those documents. Mm-hmm. I do know that they did release one formal RIF, or reduction in force. That's federal speak for it. And that's a formal action to remove staff. That was specifically for the FPM, the field policy and management staff, the folks who run the field offices, not for the program office staff in those offices. So for instance, the multi-family staff members who are stationed in Jacksonville or in Dallas, Fort Worth, or, pick your field office, they would not be affected. But the FPM staff, the field office directors, those are affected. That's the only RIF that has actually been put in place. It would take many more such actions to achieve the projected cuts in staff.
Mm-hmm. And there were also leaks about, and you referenced the field offices around the country, about significant closures of field offices, and we certainly heard that the Richmond field office was on that list. Mm-hmm. For closure. And as you point out, there have been some positions already terminated in the Richmond field office, but many of the staff are still there. Do you have any sense of where that's going, those office closures?
So I don't have a clear sense on that one. My crystal ball is about as cloudy as yours. What I will say is, to achieve the level of cut that was projected, to achieve that 50%, you're going to have to close a bunch of field offices, because the bulk of HUD staff is in the field around the country serving the American people. It's an interesting and useful contrast to think back about 9 years ago to what the Office of Multifamily did. And this was before my time, right? I observed it happening. It went through a process of transformation, which they often put a capital T on. It was a big deal because at the time there was a need for significant staff reduction, but there was also a need to really improve the business processes of the Office of Multifamily. And so they brought in outside consulting help. They did a multi-year process. They took a ton of stakeholder feedback. They did a lot of negotiations with the union, and they put in place a way to consolidate field offices into a smaller number of larger groups. It made a huge difference. It was disruptive for some folks, no question. But in the end, it made a huge difference in how effectively multifamily did its work. On every number you can imagine where we measured efficiency and activity, right? Loans processed, asset management actions done, all of that, numbers got way better. The other interesting thing about that is, apart from doing it in a careful process with really thinking about the business processes, is Congress was heavily involved. Congress, in fact, said, hey, you know what? Do that transformation pretty slowly. Those asset management service positions, don't consolidate them right away. Have it be a very gradual process. It wasn't the ideal method, but Congress was actively involved. And I think that is instructive for what needs to happen now. If the federal government is truly going to change so much about its workforce and its scope of work, that's Congress, right? They need to be making those decisions. And we as citizens need to be telling our members of Congress, hey, you need to be involved.
So last question about the HUD workforce. Sure. As you know, there are many presidential appointed positions in federal agencies. You were in one of them. I'm wondering if at HUD there have been any presidential appointees come in to replace the appointees that from the Biden administration that have departed. This is, of course, how administrations typically carry out their policy priorities is through appointees. Any?
There have been a few, and folks should who are listening should remember that the number of presidential appointees is comparatively small. It's a few people at the top of the pyramid. The vast majority, and I mean really vast majority, think there were, I don't know, 50 roughly appointees at HUD out of a workforce of 9,000, right? That's the kind of proportions we're talking about. It is mostly dedicated career staff who serve rain or shine, political party to a political party, right, regardless of administration. There have been a few appointees. Obviously, you have the HUD secretary who's been appointed and has been serving. He was one of the first confirmed, which in some sense was good. Often HUD secretaries get confirmed a little later in the process. So Secretary Turner got confirmed very early. I know there is a deputy assistant secretary appointed. That doesn't require Senate confirmation. So this was my old job. It's Lamar Seats, who was in that job in the prior Trump administration. So my successor was also my predecessor, and that's
Okay. Mm-hmm.
that's good. He's a dedicated houser. He has great lending experience and a real appreciation for the work. So I'm glad to see him in seat.
Okay.
There are a few others, but there's still some real vacancies too.
Yeah. Okay. Let's shift and talk a little bit about budget and funding issues, and maybe start with what's currently working its way through Congress, which is the reconciliation bill. That's a big bill that I guess the big issues there are around tax cuts and tax cuts, and then also cuts to Medicaid and other big issue programs. But wondering if there is anything in that reconciliation that housers should be focused on. And,
sure.
Yeah.
And let me highlight the biggest top line are some provisions from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act to strengthen and improve the low-income housing tax credit. The three pieces I believe that made it into the draft reconciliation bill that's being considered, one would restore the housing credit allocation increase for 2026 through 29, so more credits, more dollars for housing. The second is lowering the 50% private activity bond threshold test to 25%. That's a big deal. It's super technical, but it makes bond deals much easier to do. And that will help preservation of existing housing. It may also help creation of new affordable housing. And the third is providing for a 30% basis boost in rural and tribal communities. That, again, helps those deals be more feasible economically. There are a lot of ways that allocating agencies can apply a basis boost, but this gives them, a little bit more authority to do it, and I think is a real positive, especially because rural and tribal communities, that's some of the toughest housing to develop. The economics are just against you in a lot of ways. So I'm glad to see those priorities being addressed.
Great. Well, that is some good news, and hopefully those provisions stay in.
That would be good.
We'll find out soon. So we're operating under a continuing resolution now. So for FY25, I think housing programs haven't seen much change in funding from previous years.
Right.
But of course, the administration just released their FY26 skinny budget, and that includes very significant reductions in HUD programs, including vouchers, Section 8, rental assistance, CDBG, homelessness funding, public housing. How do you view this playing out in Congress over the next 6-8 months? Do you believe that Congress House and Senate will go along with these kinds of draconian reductions? There's also, as you know, an effort, and I think this was true in the first Trump administration, to block grant many of these programs to states and transfer responsibility for more responsibility for affordable housing to states. What is your crystal ball saying for how this budget will play out for housing?
Sure. And I'll start big picture, which is what the president is proposing would be disastrous for housing. I'm not going to sugarcoat this at all. Major cuts, vast disruption. And I think a lot of people would suffer as a result. Both people who are currently housed, who might have their housing disrupted, and those who could have been housed but for these cuts. That said, I've been doing this a long time, not as long as you, but a long time. I've seen a lot of presidents' budgets, and I've talked to appropriation staffers many times about them. The phrase they love, the sentence they love to say is, the president proposes and Congress disposes. Congress has the power of the purse. And the president's budget is a mixture of statement of values and suggestions for Congress. It does not have the force of law. So it's a very open question as to what Congress will do. I'll give you one example that I found both most disturbing and I think may be most illustrative here, which is the skinny budget proposes cutting the project-based rental assistance, all of those programs all mashed together roughly in half, and block granting it to the states. So saying to the states, hey, although the federal government committed to pay the rent for many years on these properties, we're not going to pay half of that, and you all sort it out. Figure out who gets paid, who doesn't, who has to get evicted, who has to shut down, who has to do something else. That would be a disaster. Primarily for the folks living in those properties, receiving government assistance and having a stable home, but also for all of the loans and equity investments and local commitments that depend on the commitment of the federal government to pay that rent. Historically, Congress has always paid project-based Section 8. And I hope and expect that members of Congress will hear from their constituents how important this is and take action to preserve it. I know in the most recent continuing resolution, there was what's called an anomaly, right? A special provision that allowed HUD to fully pay these project-based Section 8 contracts, even though everything else, for the most part, was at last year's levels. But everyone listening to this knows the rent goes up every year, whether you're living in an assisted property or not, and so the federal government needs to pay those bills. As you described, though, there are a whole lot of cuts proposed in a whole lot of areas. So, I hope that Congress will recognize the housing crisis we are in and take the action needed to at least preserve the assistance for the people currently being assisted. But they're only going to do that if they hear really loudly and really frequently from all the people affected how important it is.
Do you think that, even if the proposed reductions are mitigated significantly, that we will see some block granting to states of some programs, or that?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, converting a program from, a direct federal program to a block grant has been precursor to cutting it. Because if you think about it, it means it shifts the apparent responsibility. People whose assistance is reduced in one form or another, whether it's a locality or an individual household or a developer, they're looking to the state suddenly instead of the federal government. Oh, Arizona cut my funds, Texas cut my funds, not Washington cut my funds. I hope this Congress will not do that. The fact that the skinny budget is so transparent about what it's doing, right? It proposes both the cut and the block grant at the same time. It's like, yes, the label is on the tin. We know what you're doing. I hope that Congress will not go along with that.
Yeah. Before HUD, you spent time at FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Agency, that oversees the GSEs. And there has been a bit of turmoil there as well, with
Yes.
some changes in board. I think one of the CEOs is now gone. Do you have a sense of what the administration has in mind for GSEs and how that might play out in terms of affecting affordable housing programs?
So that one is quite unclear. We're seeing really conflicting messages and actions coming out of FHFA and other parts of the federal government. keep in mind that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Federal Home Loan Banks, all of which are overseen by FHFA, are a really important part of the capital that flows to housing. So disruptions there cascade throughout the system. It's not localized to specific areas. It's the nation's mortgage markets. And that's a problem if those get disrupted. As you said, we have seen changes in the boards, but I'll be more specific about that. We saw the FHFA director remove roughly 2/3 of the boards each of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and then appoint himself the general counsel and a couple other folks affiliated with the administration to those boards. This is the first time I have ever seen the regulator of an agency sit on the board of that agency. It makes no sense to me. Maybe it makes sense to someone else. But it is very worrisome. We've seen a lot of disruption. We've seen removals at the high levels. We've also seen staff removals deeper within the agencies, and it is focused on folks who are doing the work of affordable housing, doing work associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, doing work associated with energy efficiency and climate resilience. Not bad things, things we need. We have seen removals and folks put on administrative leave at FHFA, including a big proportion of their research staff, a big proportion of their fair lending oversight staff. These are not folks you want to be missing when it's time to keep an eye on how mortgage markets are functioning. So at the same time, we have seen some discussion of trying to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, whether exercising those warrants. We haven't even seen any sort of specific plan, but there's been some discussion of that. There's a lot of complexity there. We won't go into it all now, but the disruption we're starting to see as a result of the staff changes and the board disruptions isn't really compatible with safe, sound, profitable companies that you would release for private investment. So it is a bit puzzling.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as you know, the National Housing Trust Fund, which has been an increasing important resource for providing housing, particularly to very low income renters,
Yep.
Is supported by through the GSEs, through Fannie, I think in particular.
Through both.
Through both.
Fannie and Freddie. Yep.
Yeah. Do you think there's risks there in terms of the viability of the National Housing Trust Fund going forward? Is there enough support to retain that?
So it's a provision of statute, right? There's a law that says the funds that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac generate, a very tiny slice of them, but a certain amount of funds, must be allocated to the National Housing Trust Fund. So as long as FHFA is following the law, I don't think there's a risk. I have not heard any proposal from Congress to change that. Even if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were taken out of conservatorship and returned to private entities, that law would still apply and the funding would still be there. That said, we're in a really risk strewn environment. So who knows what Congress will do? We've seen weird things in the past. And I would say if folks that are working with and value the National Housing Trust Fund, yeah, it's a great thing to talk to your members of Congress about.
Well, that's a good lead into my last question, which you alluded to earlier, which is what should affordable housing advocates in Virginia and everywhere, for that matter, be doing right now? I think there's a bit of a feeling of being overwhelmed with so many issues being put on the table, such a broad range of threats across the board, that I think it has put advocates a little bit, push us backwards a little bit. But what do you see as the way to get organized and get our voices back in an effective way, in the most effective way?
And I think that is the most important question, because you're right. There has been a deliberate attempt by this administration to put folks on the back foot, to threaten a whole lot of things all at once, really fast, in a confusing, and I'll just say, in my non-lawyer opinion, illegal way in a lot of ways. The best thing people can do is raise their voices loudly and frequently. One of the great things about the Virginia Housing Alliance and the other organizing groups out there is that you give people help doing that, right? You help them do it in an organized way. It's good to contact members individually, and folks should, but doing it with the support of an organization that can help organize priorities, provide you talking points, provide you with data to back up the concerns you're raising, that's incredibly valuable. I would say don't worry too much about limiting the number of things you ask about and raise concern about. There's a whole lot going on, and people should hear about it in Congress. And if they get a laundry list of 15 things or 30 things that are all threatened and are all important, make it clear these are all threatened and these are all important and we need them. Put differently, don't negotiate against yourselves. Don't say, oh, I'm just going to focus on one thing because that's the most important, even though all these others are. No, talk about all of it. They need to hear. That's
Right.
how the system functions, is when they hear from the voters, from the people they serve, here's what's needed.
Well, Ethan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And in the next few months are going to be decisional on so many of these things we've talked about. I hope maybe in the fall we might be able to get back with you, catch up with you again, and maybe review the landscape at that point. And particularly, you'll have a different perspective. We'll see how your new state, Massachusetts, is responding, which has always been a place where there's a lot of creative activity going on in affordable housing. So
that's right.
They're lucky to have you coming back there, and best of luck with that.
Well, thank you. I feel really fortunate to be heading back there because Massachusetts has made such a commitment to affordable housing, including last August passing a $5 billion affordable housing bill. And I also feel really fortunate to be able to talk with you and share some thoughts with all the good folks in Virginia. So thanks for having me.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for listening in, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another interview.